Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I have a special guest who was on my channel before, 3 weeks earlier. Todd Lewis from the Praise of Folly Podcast. Recently on this channel, he was discussing and defending empires. He recently had a debate with his friend Keith, who is an anarchist, and he had further discussions on his channels about empire and defending the concept of empires. So I decided to continuing discussion on my channel. Um, do you want to explain your interests about defending empires and their benefits?
Yeah, sure. So the debate that I had with Keith Preston, well, as a preface to that, I think you and your audience have probably all heard of straw manning. The opposite of straw manning is steel manning. I think in some sense, Sam Harris sort of made that a popular phrase. And so one of the things that I did in this debate was sort of give the best arguments that I could in favor of imperialism, because I personally don't endorse imperialism, but I wanted to sort of play devil's advocate and see, because I've noticed just certain things throughout history that anti-imperialist positions don't understand. So that's sort of how it started.
Interesting. So, like throughout your understanding of history, you understand that empires often facilitate commerce and also often install trade cities, trade routes, and even for the Roman Empire, they are known for their extensive use of roads. And Ming in the Ming Dynasty of ancient China, they're also known for their commerce, paper money, and very well intricate bureaucracy. Like, um, like these are the benefits that you see with empires, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. One of the things that you'll see a lot is commerce really only takes place uh, with empires or under the penumbra of an empire. The example that I used in the debate was the Silk Road. The Silk Road, when the great Eurasian empires, in one or more, were collapsed, trade dried up. I mean, you're not going to travel 6,000 miles, without being more or less guaranteed that you're going to get to your destination with the goods that you have, and then return back with the goods that you bought whilst away. And that just can't be guaranteed in the absence of a security commons, which is what the empires provide.
Do you want to reiterate one of Keith's arguments for the audience?
Well, want me to bring up his? Well, Keith's argument primarily was whatever benefits the empire. Well, first of all, whatever the benefits that are claimed by the empires, that's suspect. So first thing he does is he challenges that, well, you actually need the empire to do these things. And then B, he's like, okay, let's say also, for the sake of argument, that maybe you do need the empire to do these things. But is the cost of doing those things worth having? So right, maybe we do need an empire for international trade, but is international trade worth the cost of the empire? And those more or less were his two main arguments in the debate.
Mm, yeah, like the broken windows fallacy.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
okay, from his perspective, from a more like if you're like a more spiritual guy, from a more spiritual place, you kind of view empires as a peak of decadence, as a peak of the steady decline or decay of civilization or culture. Um, from from that perspective, as of right now, we see America well slowly coming apart and been documented for a very very long time through the decline of families and communities, and due to the fact that America is in fact an empire. Well, not exactly an empire. It's not an imperial empire by any means, but Um, it's we kind of see this with the expansion of the expansion of power with the president as is required. If you're want to have a dominant military presence and you store the need required to act now. Um, just I just sort of just view empires as sort of a good thing, but a bad thing as well, because that usually is a sign of decline for a civilization, from my point of view. Um,
Well, that's interesting that you bring up the moral criticism, because Keith Preston is a moral anti-realist, so he didn't really use the moral argument against empire, but it's actually a very strong one, and I think he probably should have used it anyhow just to strengthen his overall case.
Also, a friend of mine wanted to join this stream. Do you mind that, or is that okay with you?
Oh yeah, sure, you can invite your friend on.
Okay. Yeah. Just do you you're still pretty much non-intervention and still highly critical of this meth still highly critical of America in its handling of foreign policy, correct?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah. It's We live in rather interesting times.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah. Just also, do you want to also this to what do you think is the major factor that caused the declines of great empires?
Yeah, that's a good point. Good question. I mean, I think there's a lot of factors, but one thing that I think is key is we see this cycle in history that in order to maintain international trade routes, whether on sea or by land, you need an imperial hegemon to police them. But then, of course, the cost of the military rises in order to maintain the protection of the trade routes, because you have to deal with other competing empires. Um, and so what ends up happening is you don't have the trade routes without the imperial army or navy, but then they become so expensive that they can't recoup the cost that the trade route would give them. And so what ends up happening is, in order to protect the trade routes, they end up bankrupting themselves over the long run, because the cost of military production continues to go up. And so you
Ah,
have this strange cycle where the trade routes sort of, the fact that people want to use the trade routes necessitates the rise of an empire. But then in order to police them uh, over the centuries, the cost of military production goes up. And when that happens, they go bankrupt. So that's one way that happens.
mm,
Um, I mean, another way is just imperial overreach. They take too much. And they don't I mean, a good example would be like Justinian, right? He tries to take over the old Western Roman Empire, and it pretty much bankrupts the Eastern Roman Empire, and it's almost destroyed 50 years later by Persians and then later Saracens. Almost. Well, as we know, it wasn't destroyed. But a good example of overreach as well would be like Athens during the Peloponnesian War when they attacked Syracuse. Complete imperial overreach. And that's what led to their downfall. So I think there's like systemic problems that lead to a downfall of an empire, like rising cost of security, which ultimately they just can't pay for it and they go bankrupt and collapse. Or in the case of the Western Roman Empire, the cost they outsource the cost of production to the foederati, the German mercenaries, and then they turn against the state itself. So
so, what do you think is the major cause of decline in America in Pax Americana? Um,
well, for the American Empire, the, I would argue that probably the most important, at least that we see easily, is the bankruptcy, the problem of financial insolvency. That's huge, which is also coupled with imperial overreach. And there's no reason why the United States has to be the one nation that makes all the trade routes work. I mean, Japan could easily pay for a navy to police the Indian Ocean and South and Pacific. They're part of the Pacific. Um, and there's no reason why, given the wealth of Europe, some sort of combined NATO naval presence couldn't police trade in the Mediterranean and the Eastern Atlantic. So we're trying to do too much. That's a big problem.
Yeah, just also there's also as mentioned before, the moral decay inside inside great empires like in America, communities and families are virtually on decline. Um, Also, in the British Empire, well, the British Empire also, although the British Empire pretty much destroyed itself, but I think they pretty much kept their morality in check from my observations.
Well, with the British, hold on, if you don't mind, with the British, we have an interesting thing here because the moral decay that we see today in the United States really wasn't present in the British Empire. But their problem was they kind of committed, harikari with Germany in 2 world wars. They at the height of their power, they just had this sort of atavistic, self-destructive behavior that they just threw themselves against the Germans, and in the end, they were both destroyed.
It seemed like from realists from Henry Kissinger to George Kenneman, it seemed like they abandoned balance of power politics. That seemed like seemed like a leading cause of the destruction of their empire. Like they become arrogant. They were blinded by hubris.
Yes, well, you see, this gets into another reason why empires fall. This is sort of related to Hayek's knowledge problem, right? Because Hayek says that you cannot plan an economy because no one individual or group of individuals can have enough knowledge to know what needs to be produced when, and how much to sell it for and where to ship it to. And we have a similar problem here, right? Because with an empire, even in one that's theoretically democratic like our own, or even Athens, we have this built-in oligarchy where power is just of necessity centralized. And people at that level, there's a knowledge problem. Like there's information on the imperial frontiers coming in, but it takes too long to get to the leadership to make a timely decision. There's a lot of lag through the bureaucracy. Another problem that arises with an empire is that the implications of your decisions are not immediately seen. So, for example, if you're a small state and you start a war, the costs are immediately felt. But if you're an empire and you start a war, the war could last for years, and you may ultimately lose, but you don't necessarily know that. The cause and effect is blurred, and that leads to what you pointed out, this sort of hubristic decision making.
Yeah, just like it seemed like at the beginning, nations seemed to be more conscious of their power, but as over time, they just become rather drunk with it, as we've seen with the British, as right now with America, if they keep on screwing up. Also, a point you mentioned Hayek, who is an Austrian economist. Other thing about other Austrian economists, Hoppe pointed out in Democracy, the guy that failed. It seemed like democracies, well, democratic empires as of right now, liberal hegemony, cannot. It seemed like they cannot start limited war. It seemed like there's been a rise of total absolute war in this modern era that we live in.
Because what ends up happening, beginning with the French Revolution, is one of the side effects of giving the average person a stake in the government has generally so far led to a totalizing effect on war. Because probably when a war was between kings and emperors, you didn't really need to convince the entire population to go along. You just fought your war. You called up your nobles, hired some mercenaries, and life just kind of went on around those people. But now that they have a stake in the system, you have to justify it to them. And so, of course, that also leads to people thinking. So when you justify it to the mob, it's much easier to do it with demagoguery, right? So, oh, these people are evil, they're this and that, so we got to destroy them. And then the other thing is, you see, when you fight another nation that has a similar attitude where the people are given a stake in the government, it's easier to see them as combatants in some sense that they're actively supporting the government that you're at war with. And that seems to be some of the results of democratization.
Yes. Um, just where do you think where do you think that empires like such as the British and Roman Empire usually go right besides facilitating commerce? Where do you think they go right?
Well, the other thing that they do is they provide security, which is necessary for civilization. So, for example, with the Germanic invasions, which ushered in the Dark Ages, and the perpetual raids by Vikings and Turks and Huns and Saracens, Western Europe was kind of in a state of lockdown. Nothing was happening because you didn't have any security. Whereas, like, say, with the Roman Empire, right, you have large areas of the Mediterranean basin that are secure from threats. So urban centers can develop, technology can develop, culture can develop. So before the Roman Empire, Western Europe was a dunghill, and after the Roman Empire was a dunghill. The per capita incomes and general wealth of Western Europe didn't really reach parity with the Roman Empire until the 18th century.
Yeah. Just seemed like the collapse of the Roman Empire did really set back Europe, really caused serious retroaggression, living standards, and income for a very, very, very long time.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
it seemed like it seemed like it took like nearly nearly 1,000 years to get where they at right now in Western Europe, due to the
Yeah.
fact that the retroaggressions were so bad.
Well, because what ended up happening, right, is with the collapse of the security commons that the Roman Empire provided, you had massive deurbanization and you had no trade. Right. One of the factors of innovation and development is cross-pollination with other cultures. And if you don't have enough security to trade or travel, then you're not going to be, cross-pollinated. So, for example, right, Western Europe begins to come out of its malaise when it's reintroduced to classical thinking. First, via the Saracens in Spain with Averroes and Avicenna around the 11th and 12th centuries AD. And then you get from the east, with the fleeing of the destruction of the Eastern Roman Empire, Greek scholars coming to Italy. So by having this cross-pollination with Saracen scholars and Roman scholars from the east, Western Europe is, they get cross-pollination. Furthermore, under the Pax Mongolica, ideas from Asia were transmitted to the West because you have this security commons that allowed people to travel and spread new ideas. And of course, what put Europe in a unique position at this time was that unlike the other parts of Eurasia, which were conquered and destroyed by invading armies, by the time you get to the 11th century, Western Europe is largely free from these invasions. And so they get all the benefits of cross-pollination without being conquered. So that's actually really a really, I think, important factor in the rise of Western Europe.
Yeah. Um, since we're on the rise of Western Europe, do you want to explain England's the England's development in particular? Because since they're the first country that had their industrial revolution, um, from my understanding of it, a book called Why Nations Fell by two economic historians, it said that the Glorious Revolutions fundamentally changed the institutions, the political institutions in England forever, like setting off the better path for the for the better, like due to the fact were a constitutional and limited monarchy. They had pretty much strong securement of private property, and the fact they were an island, that so they couldn't get invaded that much. That much. It seemed like it really set England to a better path, like economically speaking.
Well, if you look at England, right, there's a lot of factors involved in why England was successful. Being an island, unlike many other European countries, England wasn't constantly being invaded. Since 1066, England was only really invaded twice. Once under the reign of King John. I don't really know if these two events can be considered invasions, because during the reign of King John, when the nobles revolted, they invited the King of France to rule them, and he came over to rule over the barons for a while, and until they got John to settle at the Magna Carta, and the King of France went back. And then, of course, 1688, which you just mentioned. So since they were invited, I don't consider them invasions. So technically, 1066 was the last time England was invaded. So that right there is huge, right? Because France, during, say, the 100 Years' War, was devastated. Italy was devastated through the wars of the city-states, through the wars of the Habsburgs and the Bourbons, the Habsburgs and the Valois, and then the Habsburgs and the Bourbons in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. Throughout the Middle Ages, Spain was at war in the Reconquista. And Eastern Europe was Eastern and Southern Europe are being invaded by Mongols and Turks. So you have that. They haven't been conquered. Two, they have one of the things that we notice is in Richard Pipes' book on property and freedom, where he compares England and Russia and how they developed differently. The medieval system was fairly decentralized. And the great states of Europe, like Spain and France and Prussia and Austria and Russia, in order to provide security against these threats, they developed strong military autocracies. And whereas England didn't have to deal directly with these kinds of threats. So the pressures to develop a strong central monarchy were not there. And so they could freely develop in this direction.
So the demand for the state was very, very low then.
Yes, because England was basically safe. It wasn't being invaded, and so see, right? It's the threat of attack that usually gets people to support a powerful military state. Because if you're not being attacked and you're not having your livelihood destroyed by foreigners, then yeah, you're really not that interested in having the government be larger. You want it to be smaller, because it becomes a nuisance, right? It's always telling you what to do, taxing you.
Other thing to know, like in the modern context, the reason why many neoconservatives often complain about America being egoistic, being very isolationist in their own terminology, anyway, is due to the fact that we are really geographically isolated from the rest of the world. Also, there's no chance that any country with any sense that can't invade the United States due to the fact we have a very strong military presence even in our homeland.
Yeah. But one of the things with empires, I think the most successful empires are those that can maintain a measure of decentralized decision-making as long as possible. I mean, obviously, an empire by definition is a consolidation of power and decision-making. But the Romans took a really wrong turn with Diocletian, where they just centralized everything in this, turning him into like a god king. Whereas, like with the British and the American empires, we still been able to maintain a lot of decentralized decision-making processes.
Yes.
And that's what made us so successful. One could argue that's what made Athens successful, right? Athens was an empire, the Delian League. But again, they were able to generally have decentralized decision-making processes. Um, you could argue the same for the Italian city-states of Genoa and Venice. They had their own merchant empires, and Venice lasted for 1,000 years. So, and again, they had a decentralized. They were able to preserve a decentralized decision-making process.
At the same time, they also cultivated virtues such as trust, and pretty much develop highly developed social capital in those city states of Italy at the time.
Yeah, that's another thing too, is that the social capital that led this or that particular nation to become a successful empire is paradoxically eroded by the decadence that the empire allows to take place with all the wealth and power. So the wealth and power of the empire, it then leads to decadence and degeneracy, which then undermines the social capital that got them to where they are in the first place.
Yeah, sort of like you mentioned Hayek before. Like for English case, it was sort of like they sort of have this bottom up kind of thing for law, like law is older than legislation kind of thing, common law. That sort of just led to the creation of norms and social capital due to this unique way of handling laws and criminals. Um, yeah. Um, let's look at empire. Let's look at extractive empires such as the Russian Empire, who never been a high trust society ever in its history. Has always been despotic,
Yeah.
due to it being run like a mafia state, which has its roots in how the Mongols treated them, and also the weather, the environment, and how big and expansive Russia is. Um,
Yeah. Well, Russia is the sort of prototypical uh, extractive empire. They don't develop assets. So um, let's probably start with defining the terms, right? A empire that creates wealth is one that protects trade and helps develop innovation. So in the West, that would have been like the Roman Empire, the British Empire, the American Empire, um, various colonial empires. I think the French and the Dutch, to some extent, the Portuguese, were also constructive empires in that regard. Um, but an extractive empire, again, it's more like you just treat people as it's one giant tax farm. you know. I think Pipes is right that Russia, that the Mongol period was a hugely formative period in Russian history, because prior to the Golden Horde, Russia was developing essentially representative institutions like the rest of Europe was. But unlike England and Scandinavia, and like say Southern Europe and Iberia, they were open to invasion and of course conquest. And so people are like, well, the Mongols, being ruled by the Mongols sucks. And so the trade-off is you need to have a powerful state to drive that, and then after them the Turks. And so that's in part what drove them to this autocratic centralized institution. Because when the Mongols took over, they destroyed all the vetches. The vetch was a popular assembly of adult males. And they destroyed them because they correctly understood that they would be a threat to their continued rule. And so 200 years of this, they were cut off from this European tradition. And unfortunately, the state that united Russia was Muscovy. And Muscovy, of course, adopted many of the Mongol strategies. Now, another thing is, it's also, I think, also due to their orthodoxy, because they look to the Eastern Roman Empire as their sort of mother. Missionaries came from the Eastern Roman Empire to convert them, and that was an autocracy. And so I think even without the Mongols, their religion would have had an autocratic pull to it, because they would have seen the origin of Eastern Orthodoxy in the Roman Empire, and the whole imperial theology is worked into that. Now, Novgorod did not lose those institutions throughout, because the Mongols never conquered Novgorod. Fortunately, Muscovy did, in which case the last institutions of Western representative government were destroyed in Russia. Now, you mentioned the weather and the climate. I'm not necessarily sure that cold weather really is all that determinative, because Scandinavia, Canada, and much of the United States are extremely cold, and yet they've been able to maintain and develop representative institutions. Classic example would be Finland, and they're very close to Russia, and yet still they were able to do that. So,
Well, America has sort of like a more balanced climate. North America sort of just have a balanced climate. It's just that
yeah,
it's just how expansive and backwards and how feudal Russia was back then. Even in modern Russia, there are still people that are extremely poor, still extremely in poverty. Right? There's still grave robbing for God's sakes in Russia. Um,
yeah. Well, Russia is an example of a failed state. I mean, reasonable people don't want to replicate Russia
or Turkey.
or Turkey. Well, I mean, let's put it this way, right? Islam and Eastern Orthodoxy haven't done very well for the people that live under them.
Yeah. Also, I guess another classical example of a extractive empire is the Spanish Empire. Since they never
Yes.
really developed any commerce, they never developed any strong human capital. They just sort of just adapted this party culture domestically, and they just were deeply irresponsible with their conducting foreign affairs. Um,
Exactly. That's factoring in the Spanish Armada. None of the ships were built in Spain. All of the ships for the Spanish Armada were built outside of Spain.
just hey, at least Britain has its own pride to build their own navy.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing too is an empire that's sustainable. The more sustainable empires tend to be maritime or commercial. Commercial empires like the Italian city-states, Venice and Genoa, the Dutch, the British, and now the Americans, they tend to be more sustainable. I think it's in part because they're profitable. Trade is profitable. And as long as you're encouraging innovation in commerce, you're likely going to be able to cover your costs when it comes to providing security. Whereas an extractive empire, like say Russia or Spain, or the Chinese empires, they're not making anything. And especially when they're already poor, because Russia's poor, China's poor, you're not going to be getting much. It's the Laffer curve. The more you tax people, the less revenue you get. And of course, that was first described by Ibn Khaldun in the 14th century. So the extractive empire is just bad economics. It just doesn't work.
Yeah, just seem like just seem like it's easier just to extract than actually build something from the bottom up.
Yeah, in fact, that's in part why the Roman Empire fell, right? Because early on, the Roman state was a productive state, encouraging trade, commerce, and innovation. But during the imperial period, they gradually became extractive. You get to the 3rd century with the barracks emperors like Septimus Severus, and then later the Dominate with Diocletian, and innovation just pretty much stops. And it's just the Roman everything. The entire economy is based on supporting the army. And at that point, that's when the Roman Empire becomes more of an extractive empire.
Yeah, let's go to a unique case. What about Germany? They only was recently unified as a nation since Germany just has a very unique history. But I think Germany is just unique because it was just never consolidate an empire, or not on a massive scale compared to Great Britain at the time. It's like they were just sort of just decentralized and had their own states for a very, very long time until Bismarck united them in 1872, I believe.
71.
71. Okay.
Close. Well, do you want to talk about the Holy Roman Empire too? Because that's also a German empire.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Let's make the Holy Roman Empire unique. Um,
Well, the Holy Roman Empire was, of course, founded by Emperor Charlemagne, 800 or December 25th, 800 AD, when he's crowned Holy Roman Emperor. And this was an attempt by the Franks and the Catholic Church to rebuild the Western Roman Empire. Um, and due to the inheritance of Gallican succession, where your children each get an equal portion of the empire, kept on being divided, till finally you had East and West Francia. East Francia becoming Germany, West Francia becoming France. Now, but when you have East Francia, then you get the what's unique about them is during the Viking raids, they were not hit very much, because there's only a small part of the Frisian and coast that they actually controlled, and they were not as rich as England or Western France. So they weren't really pillaged by the Vikings that much. They had some raids from the east with the Magyars, but by 955 they defeated them at the Battle of Lechfeld, and by 999 the Magyars were converted to Christianity. So I think, interestingly enough, East Francia probably was the least pillaged of those kingdoms of Western Europe during that period of nomadic and Viking raids. And certainly there are no Saracen attacks, because Saracens were too far south.
and the Habsburgs Empire. Oh,
Well, the Habsburgs were a part of the Holy Roman Empire. They were a later dynasty that was founded in the 13th century. But one of the things that you see, though, is early on, under the Ottonian dynasty, they were quite strong. They were probably the strongest military power in Europe. But what ended up happening is, over the centuries, struggles with the Pope over various issues, including most significantly the appointing of bishops, led to erosion of control, because the Pope would just say to the nobles, well, okay, your oath of loyalty to the emperor is void because the emperor, upset me today. And so the Holy Roman Emperor could never really consolidate Germany, because the Pope kept on, undermining his vassals' support. Now, Frederick II tried to unify Italy, short of Papal States, obviously. But of course, Italy's, the papacy did not want the Holy Roman Empire to have total control of Italy, because then they would have the screws put on them, and they didn't want that. So they were preventing the unification of Germany and Italy. Whereas in France and Spain and England, there was no direct conflict with the papacy. So the state could then centralize and become a nation normally, that we would see in the rest of Europe. And by the time you get to the whole empire begins to decline in the 13th century and isn't really a powerful military force. But the Habsburgs, which you mentioned, they turn it around. They set up their power in Austria. They drive back, they ultimately drive back the Turks. They hold them off, and then they drive them back. They consolidate control over southern Germany. And they sort of have a revival in the 16th and 17th centuries as a great power. But then we end up with, the age of Napoleon, where Voltaire says, the Holy Roman Empire is neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. So
all
it was
right
not
then.
really a failure. It did not restore the Roman Empire. So
Yeah. Also, the Ottoman Empire, which
that's also an extractive empire. That's a classic example of an extractive empire.
this empire is sort of unique because it's sort of a multicultural empire. Like they were never like a nation, or they are.
Mm.
I don't know.
Well, yeah, the Turks, yeah, they were terrible. I mean, nobody's like, hey, let's bring the Turks back.
No. Just it seemed like what caused the decline of empire, the other empire, the Ottoman Empire. It seemed like It seemed like they ended their empire after the First World War.
Yeah, they did.
Oh, what caused of this? Was it due to the British?
Yeah, the British wanted to remove the Caliph. See, the Ottoman Emperor was also the Caliph, the head of the Islamic Sunni Islam. And so you end up with this happening. And I think I'm not entirely sure why they got rid of the caliph, but they wanted, oh, I think in part because they wanted to dismember Turkey itself. At the end of World War I, Turkey was divided between France, Italy, and Britain as mandates, and they had their own, and in Greece. But none of the great powers really wanted to fight for Turkey. The Greeks did, and that led to the Greco-Turkish War, where Kemal defeats the Greeks. And the Allies are exhausted from World War I and don't really have the political will to continue fighting in Turkey, and they allow Mustafa reconstitutes Turkey.
Just man, we're always seem like we're living in the age of the. We seem like we're always living in the age of the rise of empires and decline of empires. Right now, I think right now in our modern era, I think you're definitely in the decline of Pax Americana. It's kind of sad, to be honest. I think America never was suited to be an empire in the first place.
Well, the problem is who's going to replace it, and the contenders that are going to replace the Pax Americana don't look so good.
There's China. There's the Islamic State.
India.
India. India is still pretty much a weak economy. Russia is too weak right now. They're destroying themselves through their expansionism. Yeah. No real good alternative to visit now.
No, that's kind of the problem right now. The United States, because there's always going to be some nation vying for this position. Whether you like it or not, that's just the way the world works. And so these other groups that are going to compete for it, what they would bring to the table, I don't know. It's it just doesn't look good.
Well, it does. I don't know. Although I think we're assuming too much about this is going to be another unipolarly world. I think we're going to return to a multipolar world with the United States, China, and maybe Russia, or maybe the European powers if they stop supporting the welfare states.
Well, I think Europe's in for a long, rough road. Now, with the BRICS, we could see a rise of Brazil and Turkey.
Just the question is, who shall inherit the earth?
Yeah.
I wish the meek can inherit the earth. Oh, just, let's see. If the United States loses its position, I really hope the European nation will get their stuff together. And form
they'll have to, because we won't be able to subsidize their defense.
Oh. Well, let's see. I see if stop the funding the welfare states and actually pull their funds or taxes into the military and build up the militaries, I think there will be a good chance, but that's also implying that the European Union will still be a thing.
Well, and that's doubtful with trends like Brexit and the Catalonian secession movement.
Yeah.
That's somewhat doubtful.
It's just like it's world affairs and nation and the study of nation states is very complicated. It's so hard to predict the future.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. I guess if I was gonna predict the future, I say that we're gonna see the rise of China at the end of this century. And
I mean, China being the world's largest population, I think no matter what happens, that fact alone is going to make China influential.
And they're not liberal or Christian at all, so they don't have that same type of responsibility or obligation to human rights. They don't care about human rights.
No.
No, like they have that advantage for them from a real politic point of view.
Yeah, but one of the problems is cruelty can also backfire, right? Like when France invaded Spain during the Napoleonic Wars, they would fight, they would crack down brutally on the Spanish, and it just didn't work because they got angry and became guerrilla fighters, and the French ended up creating, more hatred that way. You kind of have to go, like Genghis Khan Pyramid of Skulls to make that work. And most people aren't willing to do that.
Except the Asians.
Yes, they do seem to generally be in favor of that.
Or at least their statesmen are.
Yeah.
Although I think China's still Confucian domestically. They're still pretty much Confucian. It's still a Confucian society. So they kind of view war as like a bad, So that's why their expansionism is so very subtle. Like they're expanding to Africa. They're still expanding or creating artificial islands in the South China Sea. Um, the Chinese are just playing a long game with foreign policy, while America just due to the constraints of democracy and term limits, they sort of just need to rush. They're incentivized to rush things and just not to think things through.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, man. The question is, what must be done? I just want to live in a community covenant now.
Forcible removal, right?
Yeah, that's the only honest way to maintain like a libertarian or conservative society. That just the expulsion of just generally bad and unproductive people.
Yeah. Yeah, those the based right-wing libertarians.
Yeah, or what's Pat Buchanan ideal society? Um, what's a paleo conservative version
Well,
of an ideal
the
society?
paleo conservatives like Pat Buchanan and Bill Lynn, they tend to like the 1950s because that's where they grew up. That's when they grew up, and for them everything was working, and so that's I don't know like any more than that. But I would guess just the sort of moral social norms that predominated America before the 1960s.
Yeah, like our social, like before the 1960s, before all this social justice, sexual revolutionary thing happened, American cultural norms, social norms were pretty productive, like extremely productive, and prohibited bad behaviors. Like it prohibited polygamy. It prohibited very bad sexual preferences. Like
Mm-hmm.
it basically encourages family values, encouraged to be religious, fruitful, and charitable. That's sort of like the idea of the American civic life. Like it's just promoted this type of very strong virtues that sort of just made America a um, very unique place to live because you're encouraged to be, well, essentially American. And
Yeah.
we don't do that anymore since we're a salad bowl now.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's like when Obama said, whatever we once were, we're no longer a Christian nation anymore.
Yeah. So yeah. Also, I think I'm gonna end the stream here. You got other stream on in the
Yeah,
next
I
ten
do. I do.
minutes.
So you guys can tune into that. Yeah.
What's this? Is it gonna be on your channel?
Yeah, it's gonna be on my channel.
What's this gonna be about?
Uh, it's called Why Reactionaries Always Fail.
Can I join this one?
Uh, yeah. I
Okay.
can send you an invite when we're done. So why don't we wrap this up and get that one started?
Okay. I hope everybody enjoyed their weekend and their 4th of July. Thanks, Todd, for coming on my channel to discuss empires and what's will happen in this international order now.
Yeah.
Um,
Thanks for having me on.
so peace out and Wakanda forever.